At my son's luxurious wedding, my ex-wife showed up with a man and said in front of 120 guests, "Today I want to thank the person who gave our son a future, because clearly there are things a carpenter could never provide." The entire room turned to look at me. I lifted my glass and said nothing, but then my son stood up. In his hand was a small wooden box, and what he said next made that man lose the confidence he had been holding on to. "I truly appreciate you being here. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from, your city or country. I read every comment. If that opening made you feel something, type 'I'm here.' Just a note, some elements are fictional for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to real people or places is purely coincidental." The moment my son raised that small wooden box above the altar, I watched a man's face go completely still. Not the stillness of surprise, the stillness of someone who has just realized in front of 120 people that every move he carefully planned has been turned against him. Preston Hale stood 3 rows back in that church wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I make in a month. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on the box in Ethan's hands. And for the first time since I had known this man, since he had walked into my life and tried to buy me out of my own son's wedding, he had absolutely nothing to say. To his left, my ex-wife Diane stood just as frozen. She had arrived that morning in a white dress, her chin lifted, her smile practiced and ready. That smile was gone now. In its place was something I hadn't seen on her face in a very long time. Something that looked like the beginning of understanding. I was sitting in the front row. My older brother Marcus, a big man with silver hair and a quieter version of our father's face, was right beside me. He leaned over and said nothing. He didn't need to. We had been brothers for 61 years. Some moments don't require commentary. The church was a small one, tucked into a neighborhood just outside Portland, Oregon. The kind of place where the windows are old enough to throw colored light across the floor in the afternoon. It was the second Saturday of September, 2025, and the light coming through that stained glass was the color of honey and rust. It fell across the white flowers lining the aisle. It fell across the faces of the guests seated in 2 long rows. And it fell across my son, Ethan, who stood at the front of that room, holding a box I had built with my own hands 17 years ago. Ethan is 27 years old. He has his grandfather's hands wide across the palm, steady, the kind of hands that are good at making things. He was wearing a dark navy suit I had never seen before, and he looked, if I am being honest, like the finest thing I have ever had a hand in producing. Standing beside him was Lily, his bride, in a simple ivory dress that suited her perfectly. Lily Bennett is 26 years old, sharp and warm, in equal measure the kind of person who notices everything and says only what needs to be said. She was looking at Ethan with an expression I can only describe as readiness, not nervousness, not the trembling anticipation you might expect from a bride watching her new husband rise unexpectedly from his seat during the reception. She was ready. She had known this moment was coming. I did not know that yet. I would understand it soon enough. The reception had been underway for perhaps 40 minutes when Ethan stood. The room had been full of the particular noise of a wedding dinner. Silverware, low laughter, the sound of a string quartet playing something gentle in the corner. Then Ethan tapped the side of his glass once, and the room went quiet in the way a room only goes quiet when everyone in it simultaneously understands that what comes next is going to matter. He did not reach for the folded speech I had seen him slide into his jacket pocket that morning. Instead, he reached beneath the table and lifted the wooden box. I recognized it immediately. I had made it when Ethan was 10 years old, from the first piece of white oak he ever planned by himself in my workshop. It was small enough to hold in one hand with dovetail joints at each corner, and a simple latch I had fashioned from a piece of old brass hardware my father left behind. I had told Ethan the day I gave it to him that it was for keeping the things that mattered most. He had carried it carefully to his room that afternoon, and I had not thought much about it since. Until I opened the bottom drawer of my workbench the morning of the wedding and found it sitting there in the space where something else used to be. I had not put it there. Now here it was in my son's hands at the altar in front of everyone. And the way Preston was staring at it, with that particular stillness of a man watching something he cannot control, told me that whatever was inside that box was going to change things. Lily turned her head slightly, just enough for me to catch her profile, and I saw the corner of her mouth lift. A small smile. Private. The kind that belongs to someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular moment to arrive. I did not understand that smile yet. I want to tell you what happened next. I want to tell you what Ethan said and what it meant, and why a room full of people who had been laughing an hour earlier went so quiet you could hear the September wind against those old church windows. But to understand any of it, to understand why a simple wooden box could walk into a room and rearrange everything you need to know where the story really begins. It does not begin in this church. It does not begin on the day I learned my ex-wife had been planning something for months, or the day a man in a charcoal suit walked into my workshop and tried to make me disappear from my own son's life. It begins in a workshop in Portland, Oregon, on a winter evening in 1995. It begins with sawdust on a concrete floor, and a man with rough hands and a quiet voice pressing a set of tools into my palms and telling me something I have been trying to live up to ever since. It begins with my father. My father's name was Robert Calloway, and the first thing you need to know about him is that he built everything he ever had with his own two hands. Not as a figure of speech, literally. The workbenches in our shop, he built those. The storage shelves along the back wall, those too. Even the small wooden sign above the front door, Calloway Woodworks, painted in black letters that had faded to a soft gray. By the time I was old enough to read them, he cut that sign himself from a piece of leftover cedar on a Tuesday afternoon before I was born, according to my mother. That was the kind of man he was. If something needed doing, he did it. If something needed building, he built it. I grew up in that workshop the way other kids grow up in backyards or living rooms. It was where my father spent most of his waking hours, and so it was where I spent most of mine. I remember standing on a step stool beside his workbench, when I was no taller than his elbow, watching his hands move across a piece of wood with a patience I could not yet understand. He never hurried. He never forced anything. He used to say that wood has a memory, that every piece remembers what it was before it became what you needed it to be, and your job as a craftsman was to work with that memory, not against it. I didn't fully understand what he meant until I was about 30 years old and had my own son watching me from a step stool. The shop smelled like pine resin and machine oil, and on cold mornings the faint sweetness of the small propane heater my father kept in the corner. That smell is so deep in my memory that even now, decades later, I catch it sometimes on the air and feel 7 years old again. It is the smell of my father's hands. It is the smell of everything he gave me. Robert Calloway passed away in the winter of 1995. He was 63 years old and had been sick for a shorter time than any of us expected. I was 28. My brother Marcus, who is 3 years older than me and has always been steadier in a crisis than I am, drove 4 hours through freezing rain to be at the hospital. We were both there at the end. And in the days that followed, when the paperwork was settled and the decisions had been made, my father left me two things: the keys to Calloway Woodworks, and a piece of advice he had given me so many times over the years that I had stopped hearing it until the moment I needed it most. He said, "Do good work and let the work speak for itself." I have tried to live by that every day since. 2 years before my father passed in the spring of 1993, I married a woman named Diane. She was 23 years old, and I was 26, and we had been together long enough that our friends had stopped asking when we were going to make it official. Diane was smart and quick and laughed easily. She had a way of walking into a room and immediately knowing who in it needed cheering up. In those early years, I thought we were building something solid, the kind of life that gets better with time, the way good wood does. I remember the first time I brought her to the shop. It was a Saturday morning early in our marriage, and the light was coming through the high windows at that particular angle that made the sawdust look like it was floating in gold. She walked in slowly, running her fingers along the edge of a workbench, looking at the tools hanging in their rows on the pegboard wall. She asked me the names of things. She wanted to know what each one was for. That curiosity was genuine. I could see it in her face, and I loved her for it. I showed her everything. We had 5 years of marriage before Ethan arrived, and they were good years. Years of building and adjusting and figuring out how two people share a life without losing themselves in the process. Then, in the fall of 1998, our son was born. And I remember standing in that hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, thinking that every difficult thing I had ever gotten through had been leading to exactly this moment. Ethan Robert Calloway, 7 pounds 4 ounces, and my father's hands from the very first day. We brought him home to a house that suddenly felt fuller than its square footage had any right to allow. I used to carry him out to the workshop on Sunday mornings, while Diane slept in, just the two of us in that quiet space, the baby in the crook of my arm, while I walked slowly between the benches and talked to him about the wood. I don't know why I did that. It just seemed like the right place to introduce him to the world. By 2005, Ethan was 7 years old and had developed the habit of following me everywhere on weekends. That spring, he started coming into the shop regularly, pulling himself up onto the tall stool beside my workbench, and watching with the same focused attention I must have shown my own father 3 decades earlier. One Saturday afternoon, I handed him a small piece of white oak, smooth on one side, rough on the other, and showed him how to feel for the grain. He ran his fingers across it with such seriousness that I had to look away to keep from laughing. Then he looked up at me and asked when he could try the planer. I told him a few more years. He told me that seemed like a long time. He was not wrong. Those were the years I look back on now and recognize as the best of what we had, the 4 of us, or rather the 3 of us, because my father was gone, but somehow still present in every piece of furniture that came out of that shop. Ethan growing up with sawdust in his hair. Diane in the kitchen on Sunday evenings, the smell of dinner mixing with whatever wood I had been working with that day drifting in from the garage. But somewhere in the years that followed, something in Diane shifted. It was not sudden. It never is. It was the kind of change that happens the way a board warps in humidity, slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you set it on a flat surface and realize it no longer lies straight. She started to talk about what other people had. She started to measure things differently. The workshop, which she had once touched with curiosity, became something she mentioned with a particular flatness in her voice, as if it were a decision I had made against her, rather than a life I had built for us. I noticed. I did not know what to do about it. I kept doing good work and letting the work speak for itself the way my father taught me. It was not enough. Diane walked into that workshop exactly twice in our 18 years of marriage. The first time she ran her fingers along the edge of a workbench and asked me the names of things. The second time she came to tell me she was leaving. That was the winter of 2011. Before I tell you about the night Diane left, I want to say something that might surprise you. I don't think she was entirely the person she became on her own. That is not an excuse for what she did. It is not an attempt to soften the edges of a story that has some hard edges in it. It is just the truth, as I have come to understand it after a lot of years and a lot of quiet evenings in a workshop where there is nothing to do but think. The Diane I married in 1993 was not the Diane who walked into my son's wedding with a rehearsed smile and a plan. Those were 2 different women, and somewhere between them was a man named Preston Hale. The Diane I married was quick and funny, and genuinely curious about the world. She used to clip articles from the newspaper about things she wanted to understand better, architecture, local history, the way certain businesses got started from nothing. She had a softness to her that she didn't advertise, the kind you only saw when she thought no one was paying attention. When Ethan was born, she sat in that hospital room and held him for 2 straight hours without putting him down. And the look on her face during those hours was one of the purest things I have ever witnessed. I loved her. I want that to be clear. Whatever came after, I loved her first and for a long time. The change was gradual enough that I kept finding reasons to explain it away. She was tired. We were both working hard. Money was tighter than either of us wanted. The shop was doing fine, but not spectacularly. And fine is a word that starts to feel heavy after you've carried it for a while. I told myself these were the ordinary pressures of a life being built, and that we would get through them the way people who choose each other get through hard things. Together. What I did not account for was Preston Hale. He entered the picture in the spring of 2008 through a business conference Diane attended for her job at a regional marketing firm. He was the keynote speaker. I know this because she mentioned it when she came home that Friday evening, casually the way you mention the weather. She said he was impressive. She said he had a particular way of making every person in a room feel like they were the most important one there. I remember thinking that sounded exhausting. Preston Hale was by every external measure successful. He ran a real estate development company that had put his name on a number of buildings across the Pacific Northwest. He wore the kind of clothes that communicated net worth without stating it directly. He was 52 years old by the time I really understood who he was. And he had spent those 52 years becoming very good at identifying what people wanted and making them believe he was the one who could provide it. What Diane wanted, I think, was to feel like she was standing in the middle of something large and significant. She had a mind that deserved more than it was being given, and she knew it. And that knowledge had been sitting in her chest for years before Preston walked into a conference room and looked at her like she was exactly where she belonged. I am not saying that to wound myself. I am saying it because it is true, and because understanding it was the only way I eventually stopped being angry about it. The arguments started the way they always do in a marriage that is coming apart small, specific, reasonable on the surface. She wanted us to look at a different neighborhood. She thought I should consider whether the shop was really the best use of what I had built. She mentioned more than once that her colleague's husband had recently taken a position at a firm downtown, and that his hours were different now better. And that his family seemed, she always paused before the next word settled. I heard what she was not saying. I just didn't want to believe she was saying it. The winter of 2010 was when I found out the full truth. I will not go into the details because some things belong only to the people who live them, but I will say that the discovery was not dramatic. It was quiet, and it was thorough, and it left no room for doubt. I sat with what I had learned for 3 days before I said anything. Then I said it. Diane did not deny it. What she said instead was something I have turned over many times since she said she was sorry. But she also said she felt like herself again for the first time in years, and that she didn't know how to explain that without it hurting me, but that it was true. I have thought about that sentence more than I care to admit. The part about feeling like herself. Because I do not think Preston Hale showed Diane who she was. I think he showed her a version of who she could be, and she chose that version, and the choosing reshaped her in ways neither of them probably fully anticipated. By the summer of 2011, the decisions had been made, and the paperwork had been filed. Ethan was 13 years old. He had his grandfather's hands and his father's stubbornness and a quietness about him that I recognized as the kind that comes from paying close attention to things. He understood more than I told him. Children always do. The night Diane left, Ethan went to his room without being asked and closed his door quietly. I stood in the kitchen for a while, and then I walked out to the workshop. I turned on the single overhead light. I sat on the stool by my workbench. And then I did something I had never done before. I took out a piece of paper and I wrote a letter to my son. Not a letter to give him, not a letter I ever intended for him to read, at least not then. Just a letter to write because the things I was feeling had nowhere else to go, and a man alone in a workshop at midnight needs somewhere to put them. I wrote about what I was afraid of. I wrote about what I hoped for him, the kind of hoping that sits so deep you're embarrassed by it. I wrote about his grandfather and the shop and the belief I was trying very hard to hold on to, that doing good work and showing up every day was enough, even when everything around you was suggesting otherwise. When I was finished, I folded the paper twice and put it in the bottom drawer of my workbench. That drawer had always been where I kept things. I wasn't ready to deal with old invoices, a watch of my father's, that needed a new band, small things waiting for the right moment. The letter waited there too. Over the years, I developed a habit I never mentioned to anyone. On the nights when things felt particularly heavy, when a job fell through or a bill came in, larger than expected, or I sat alone at a dinner table set for one and felt the specific weight of that, I would go out to the shop and open that bottom drawer, not to read the letter, just to know it was there, just to remind myself of the night I sat alone and still found something worth writing down. Ethan had seen me do it, not often and never up close, but enough times over enough years that he knew the drawer meant something. He never asked me what was in it. That was the kind of boy he was, the kind who understood that some things would be explained when the time was right and who was patient enough to wait. I folded that letter and put it in the bottom drawer of my workbench. I told myself I would give it to him someday. But someday never came, so it just stayed there in the dark for 14 years. The morning after Diane left, I made 2 bowls of oatmeal. It was automatic, my hands just did. It reached for the pot, measured the water, set 2 bowls on the counter the way they had every morning for years. I didn't realize what I had done until I turned around and saw Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, watching me with those steady dark eyes of his, and noticed the empty chair across from him, where no one would be sitting anymore. I put 1 bowl back in the cabinet. I sat down across from my son. We ate breakfast together, without saying much the way people do when the words that matter most are too large for a Tuesday morning. That was the beginning of 14 years. I will not pretend those years were easy, because they were not. Single parenting is not a thing you master. It is a thing you survive, and then survive again, and then again after that, until one day you look up and realize that somewhere in the surviving, you built something real. But in those early months with Ethan, 13 years old and quieter than he had ever been, and the shop needing my attention, and the bills needing to be paid, I spent a lot of mornings making 1 bowl of oatmeal and reminding myself that today was manageable, even if tomorrow was not yet certain. Ethan and I fell into a rhythm, the way 2 people sharing a space naturally do. Weekday mornings were his. I got him up, made sure he ate something, drove him to school when the weather was bad. Weekday evenings were homework and dinner, and whatever conversation felt natural, which was sometimes a lot and sometimes almost nothing, depending on the day. But Wednesdays became something particular. Every Wednesday evening, I would pick Ethan up from school, and we would drive to a small diner about 15 minutes from the house called Margie's. It was not a fancy place, red vinyl booths, a counter with spinning stools, a pie case near the register that was always better stocked than you expected. We had the same booth every time the one in the back corner near the window. We ordered the same thing almost every week: a patty melt for me, a grilled cheese and tomato soup for Ethan, and 1 shared piece of whatever pie Margie's was featuring that day. We talked about school and the shop and whatever he was thinking about. Sometimes we argued about something small and resolved it over pie. Sometimes we just sat together in that corner booth and watched the street outside, and that was enough. Those Wednesday evenings became the fixed point of our week. Everything else could shift, but that didn't. Weekends belonged to the workshop. As Ethan grew older, his interest in the shop moved from passive observation to active participation. By the time he was 15, he could identify most of the primary hand tools by feel alone, which I considered a significant achievement, and which he considered embarrassingly basic. We built things together on Saturday afternoons, small projects at first, then more complex ones. A bookshelf for his room, a storage bench for the front hallway, a small writing desk that he designed himself at 16, and which I should say came out considerably better than my first attempt at anything at that age. What I remember most from those years is not any single project. It is the quality of the silence we had in that workshop. There is a particular kind of silence between 2 people who are comfortable enough with each other to not need to fill the space. Ethan and I found that silence early, and we kept it through all the years that followed. It was the silence of people who trust each other. The financial reality of those years was less poetic. Keeping the shop running while covering a mortgage and a teenager's expenses required a level of creativity that I did not always find glamorous. I took on extra work whenever it was available: weekend jobs, rush orders, furniture repairs for clients who needed things turned around faster than my regular schedule allowed. There were stretches, particularly when Ethan was in high school, where I was in the workshop until past midnight more nights than not. I never told him how tight things were. He was not supposed to carry that. He figured it out anyway. Children always do. In the fall of 2020, Ethan started college at a university in the Pacific Northwest, a genuine 4-year program that he had earned with his grades and I had contributed to with every side job I had taken for the previous 6 years. The orientation weekend was on a Friday and Saturday in late August. I drove 4 hours each way. I want to be honest about that drive home. It was the longest 4 hours I can remember. Not because anything went wrong, it didn't. It was because the house I drove back to was going to be quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before, and I was going to have to decide what to do with that. I decided to do what I always did. I went to the workshop and I built something. 2 years later, in the spring of 2022, Ethan called me on a Sunday afternoon. He had a particular tone in his voice, careful and bright at the same time, like someone who is about to say something that matters and is trying to sound casual about it. He said there was someone he wanted me to meet. Her name was Lily Bennett. She was 23 years old, studying environmental planning, with a way of looking directly at you when you spoke that made you feel like what you were saying was genuinely worth hearing. She shook my hand the first time we met, and then looked around my workshop with the same kind of attention I had once seen on Diane's face, but sharper, more technical. She asked me about the joinery on a cabinet I was finishing. She used the right word for it. I liked her immediately. By the summer of 2024, Ethan brought her to the house on a Sunday in July. After dinner on the back porch, he took a small box from his jacket pocket. I had known it was coming. He had called me 2 weeks earlier to tell me his plan, and to ask in the way that quiet men ask important questions if I thought it was right. I told him I thought it was exactly right. I watched Lily say yes, and I watched my son's face in that moment, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been slightly out of place for a long time. I noticed one other thing in those years, small enough that I almost didn't register it at first. When Ethan and I worked together in the shop, he would sometimes let his eyes drift toward the bottom drawer of my workbench, just for a second, just a glance. The way you look at something you've wondered about for a long time without quite finding the moment to ask. He never asked. I never explained. We had an understanding, the two of us, that some things would reveal themselves when they were ready. One evening in June of 2025, I was locking up the workshop when my cell phone rang. The number was one I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I didn't. The voice on the other end was smooth and deliberate. The voice of a man who had spent years learning how to sound like the most reasonable person in any room. "Mr. Calloway," he said. "My name is Preston Hale. I believe we have some things to discuss." I knew within 30 seconds of that phone call what kind of man Preston Hale was. Not because he said anything offensive. He was perfectly polite, and that was precisely the problem. There is a particular brand of politeness that functions less as courtesy and more as a negotiating position, a way of establishing tone before the real conversation begins. Preston had that brand refined to a point. He spoke carefully, chose his words with the precision of someone accustomed to being recorded, and managed to communicate entirely through implication that his interest in speaking with me represented an opportunity I would be wise not to dismiss. He suggested we meet for coffee. He named a place downtown, one of those establishments where the menu doesn't list prices because the clientele isn't supposed to need to ask. I told him I appreciated the call and that I was going to have to pass. A brief silence. Then he said he understood that his offer stood whenever I was ready, and that he hoped I would reconsider. He said goodbye with the warmth of a man who had not yet decided whether I was going to be an obstacle or a minor inconvenience. I set the phone down on my workbench and went back to the cabinet I had been finishing. I did not think about Preston Hale again that night. The following week, he called Ethan. I found out on a Thursday evening when Ethan stopped by the house after work. He came in through the back door, the way he always had poured himself a glass of water, and sat down at the kitchen table with that particular stillness that told me he had something on his mind. Preston had invited him to dinner at a restaurant in the Pearl District, one of those places where the lighting is dim enough to be intimate and the portions are small enough to be expensive. Ethan had gone because he believed in hearing what someone had to say before deciding what to make of it. He sat across from Preston Hale and listened. What Preston laid out was a vision. He was good at visions. Ethan said he had a way of describing a future that made it sound not just possible, but inevitable, as though the only question was whether you were going to be part of it or watch it happen from the outside. He spoke about Ethan's career, his potential, the kind of connections that open doors in the Pacific Northwest real estate world. He spoke about the wedding as a beginning, a first chapter, the kind of event that set the tone for everything that followed. And then he arrived at the condition. Walt Calloway. My name spoken with careful neutrality should consider stepping back from a prominent role in the wedding. Preston framed it as a matter of the image Ethan and Lily would be projecting to the professional community. He said it gently. He said it like he was doing Ethan a favor by raising it at all. Ethan thanked him for dinner, said he would think about it, and drove home. That same night, sitting at the desk in the apartment he shared with Lily, Ethan opened a fresh notebook and wrote down everything: the date, the restaurant, every specific thing Preston had said, as close to verbatim as memory allowed, the figures referenced, the exact language used. He told me later he did it less out of strategy than instinct. It felt like information that needed to exist somewhere outside his own head. Then he told Lily everything. Now, there is something about Lily Bennett that matters here. She is not a person who reacts to things immediately. She goes quiet when something important happens, processes it thoroughly, and speaks only when she has something worth saying. Ethan had learned to trust that quality in her the way you trust the load-bearing wall in a house you've come to know well. She listened to his account of the dinner. She asked 2 or 3 careful questions. Then she told him about a phone call. It had happened 10 days earlier on a Sunday afternoon when Ethan was driving and his phone connected through the car speakers. Lily was in the passenger seat. The name on the screen was Diane. Lily answered. They both assumed it was a routine call, but Diane had not intended to reach Ethan's phone. Or she had, but she was already mid-conversation with someone in the room when the call connected. Her voice came through in pieces, businesslike, rehearsed the tone of a conversation that had been had before. Preston's voice was audible in the background, measured and certain. Lily heard enough to understand what was being planned. She heard Walt Calloway's name used the way you use the name of a problem you have already decided how to solve. She reached over, quietly ended the call, and looked out the window at the road going past. She had been deciding what to do with what she heard ever since. Sitting together that Thursday night with Ethan's open notebook on the table between them, they made a decision. They would handle this themselves. They would be patient. They would let things develop, and they would be ready when the moment came. I was not part of that conversation. I only learned the full shape of it after everything had already happened. What I knew on Thursday evening was only what Ethan chose to tell me, the dinner, the offer, his refusal. He left the rest for reasons I came to respect later. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, 27 years old, his grandfather's hands folded in front of him, waiting for my reaction. I put my hand on his shoulder. "You handled it right, son." He nodded. We talked about other things after that, the wedding timeline, a cabinet order I was behind on the September weather forecast, the kind of conversation that holds the space around the things that actually matter. But as I watched his taillights disappear down the driveway that night, I kept one thought to myself, because saying it out loud would have served no purpose. That wasn't the last time Preston tried. It was just the first. 6 weeks before the wedding, Ethan showed up at my workshop on a Tuesday evening without calling ahead. That was not unusual in itself. He had been dropping by unannounced his whole life, the way people do, when a place has always functioned as home, regardless of where they technically live. What was unusual was the way he came in. No greeting at the door. No comment about whatever I was working on. He just pulled the old wooden stool from its spot beside the workbench, sat down on it, and watched me sand a cabinet door in silence. I kept working. The sandpaper moved across the grain, in long, even strokes, the way my father taught me, always with the wood never against it. The workshop was quiet except for that sound, and the occasional settling of the building around us, the kind of noise old structures make when the temperature drops in the evening. 4 minutes passed, then 6, then closer to 10. I had known Ethan his entire life. I knew every version of his silence, the comfortable kind, the thinking kind, the kind that meant he was working something out and needed the space to do it. This was the last one. I set down the sandpaper and looked at him. "Go ahead," I said. He did. Preston had not invited him to dinner this time. There was no restaurant, no ambient lighting, no vision carefully constructed over 2 courses and a dessert menu. This time, Preston had called Ethan directly and asked him to come by his office, a suite on the 14th floor of a building in the South Park blocks, the kind of office that communicates, through its address alone, that the person inside it considers their time worth more than yours. Ethan went because that was the kind of person he was. He sat down across from Preston's desk and waited. Preston opened a folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a number on it. He slid it across the desk without preamble, without the framing and the vision building of the first conversation. The number was specific and it was large enough. Ethan said that he understood immediately why Preston had written it down, rather than saying it out loud. It had the quality of a figure that is meant to feel final. What the number was in exchange for was this Walt Calloway's position in the wedding would be adjusted, not eliminated. Preston was careful about that word. Adjusted. A quieter role. Background photographs rather than front row. A seat that communicated presence without prominence. Preston explained it with the fluency of a man who had thought through the language in advance, who understood that the difference between a demand and a request was almost entirely a matter of phrasing. Ethan picked up the sheet of paper, looked at the number for a moment, and set it back on the desk. He told Preston no. He said it the way he said most things that matter directly without elaboration, without the kind of qualifying language that invites negotiation. Just no. He stood up, thanked Preston for his time, with the particular courtesy that means the opposite of what it sounds like, and took the elevator back down to the street. In the car before he pulled out of the parking structure, he took out his notebook. He wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. He wrote the address of the building. He wrote the number from the sheet of paper, which he had committed to memory in the seconds he held it. He wrote what Preston had said as accurately as he could reconstruct it, including the specific words Preston had used for what he wanted Walt's role to become. He noted the folder, the pre-written figure, the way Preston had slid the paper across the desk, the body language of a man who considered the conversation already settled. Then he drove to my workshop. I listened to all of it without putting down the sandpaper. Not because I was unmoved, I was not unmoved, but because stopping would have meant showing Ethan how much the number on that paper bothered me. And I did not want to give Preston Hale that particular piece of real estate inside my son's evening. When Ethan finished, I kept sanding for another few seconds. Then I set the paper down and looked at him. I asked if he was all right. He said he was. He said it with the steadiness of someone who means it, not the steadiness of someone performing it. And I believed him. Ethan had his grandfather's hands, and it turned out something else of his grandfather's as well. A core that did not shift under pressure the way old-growth wood doesn't shift, because it has had enough time and enough weight to know what it is. He stayed for another hour. We talked about the wedding details, the catering timeline, a small repair he needed done on a bookshelf in the apartment. Normal things. The kind of conversation that wraps around the difficult thing and holds it in place without making it the only thing in the room. After he left, I locked the workshop door and stood in the quiet for a while. The overhead light cast its familiar yellow circle across the workbench. The smell of sawdust and wood oil was the same smell it had always been, the smell of my father's life, and now mine. I had spent more hours in this room than I could accurately count. I had worked through grief in here and uncertainty, and the particular exhaustion of being the only adult in a household. This room had held all of it. I walked to my workbench and opened the bottom drawer. The letter was still there, folded twice the paper gone soft at the creases from years of the drawer opening, and closing around it, the edges yellowed to the color of old photographs. I did not take it out. I just looked at it for a moment, the way I always did when I needed to remember why the hard things were worth doing. Then I closed the drawer and turned off the light. 2 weeks before the wedding, Preston made his third and final move. This time, he did not go through Ethan. He came straight to me. If you're still here with me, comment 6 so I know you're still following this story. And tell me honestly, if you were in his place, would you stay silent and protect the moment? Or would you reveal everything in front of everyone? No matter the cost, I want to hear your choice before what happens next. And just a quick note, parts of this story include fictional elements for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental, and if you prefer not to continue, you can stop here. The oak dining table I had been commissioned to build was nearly finished. It was a custom piece 8 feet long, breadboard ends, hand-cut mortise, and tenon joints at every connection point. The clients had specified white oak, which pleased me because white oak is honest wood. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. You work it straight, and it gives you something that will outlast everyone in the room. I had been putting the final passes of sandpaper across the surface that Tuesday afternoon, working through the grits in sequence the way my father drilled into me before I was old enough to drive. When the bell above the workshop door rang, I assumed it was Ray. My regular hardware delivery driver, a retired postal worker who had been dropping off my orders every other Tuesday for going on 11 years, and who always knocked twice before letting himself in. I did not look up. The footsteps that crossed my threshold were not raised. They were measured and deliberate, the footsteps of a man accustomed to entering rooms and letting the room adjust to him rather than the other way around. I looked up then. Preston Hale was standing just inside the doorway of my workshop in a navy suit that had no business being within 50 feet of sawdust. His shoes were the kind that reflect light. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and looked around my shop the way a developer looks at a vacant lot, cataloging square footage, calculating potential, finding the current use quietly insufficient. He said it had a certain charm. I said nothing and went back to the table. He came further into the room, moving along the near wall where my hand tools hung in their rows on the pegboard. He looked at them the way people look at things in a museum, interested in the fact of them, indifferent to their purpose. He asked how long I had been in this location. I told him. He nodded as though I had confirmed something he had already suspected. Then he sat down uninvited on the stool beside my workbench, the same stool where Ethan had sat 3 weeks earlier, and he told me why he had come. He did not build toward it this time. No vision, no future painting, no graduated approach. He opened his jacket, removed a folded piece of paper, and set it on the corner of the table I was working on. I did not pick it up. He told me the number on it anyway. It was larger than I expected. Larger, he said, than the previous 2 conversations, combined a detail that told me he knew I was aware of those conversations, that he had either spoken to Ethan about them, or assumed Ethan had told me, and that he had decided transparency served him better than pretense at this point. The offer was direct. Walt Calloway would not appear in any formal ceremony photographs. Walt Calloway would be seated in a general guest section, away from the immediate family. Walt Calloway's role on the day would be, in Preston's word, minimized. I kept moving the sandpaper across the oak surface, long even strokes always with the grain. Preston waited. When I did not respond, he shifted his approach. He said he hoped I understood that he had significant relationships with a number of people in Portland's business and development community, and that those relationships, like all relationships, had the capacity to be useful or to be otherwise. He said he had always found it more productive to work collaboratively with people. He said he trusted I was a reasonable man. I set the sandpaper down. I straightened up and turned to face him fully for the first time since he had walked through my door. He was watching me with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades reading rooms and adjusting accordingly, and I could see him doing it now, measuring my expression, recalibrating, preparing his next move. I did not give him the opportunity. I said, "I think you should leave now," not loudly, not with the particular heat that would have felt satisfying in the moment and caused problems later. Just clearly the way you state a measurement when you want to make sure there is no confusion about it. Something moved behind his eyes, a brief recalculation, the look of a man deciding whether to push further or accept the current result and adjust his strategy elsewhere. He stood up from the stool and straightened his jacket. He picked up the paper from the corner of the table and folded it back into his pocket without looking at me. He walked to the door. There he stopped, one hand resting on the frame, and turned back with the particular composure of a man who had prepared his exit line in advance. "Just remember Walt," he said. "Nobody remembers the man who built the furniture. They only remember the man who paid for the house." Then he was gone. I stood where I was for a long moment. The workshop settled around me in the quiet. He left behind the smell of white oak and linseed oil, the afternoon light coming through the high windows at a low angle, the unfinished table in front of me, waiting with the patience that good wood always has. I thought about what he had said. I thought about my father, who had spent 30 years building things that were still standing in houses across Portland, in rooms where people ate and worked and raised their children, and whose name appeared on none of them. I thought about the dining table under my hands, which would sit in someone's home for the next 50 years and hold dinners and arguments and birthday cakes and ordinary Tuesday evenings, and which would outlast every deal Preston Hale had ever brokered. Then I walked to my workbench and pulled open the bottom drawer. The letter was there. Same as it had always been, folded twice, edges worn the paper, carrying the particular yellowish softness of something that has been kept a long time in one place. I rested my eyes on it for a moment. Then I closed the drawer and picked up my sandpaper and went back to the table. I closed the drawer and went back to work. What I did not know was that in the days that followed, someone else would open that drawer, and everything I thought I understood about that letter would change. The alarm was set for 6. I know because I checked it 3 times before I went to bed. 6 o'clock enough time to shower, dress, eat something small, and be on the road by 8. That was the plan. A reasonable plan, the kind that looks sensible on paper and falls apart by 4:30 in the morning, when your eyes open in the dark and your mind is already moving too fast for sleep to catch back up with. I lay still for a few minutes staring at the ceiling. The bedroom was quiet. Outside, Portland was doing what Portland does in early September, holding itself in that particular stillness that comes before the city wakes up before the traffic starts, before the coffee shops on Burnside prop their doors open and let the morning in. A few weeks past the end of summer, the air already carrying that first faint edge of something cooler, something that reminds you the year is turning. I gave up at 4:45. I didn't bother changing out of the flannel pants and undershirt I'd slept in. I pulled on my work boots out of pure habit, the ones by the back door, and I walked across the damp grass to the workshop, the same way I have walked to it for the better part of 30 years. Not because I had anything to finish, not because anything needed tending, just because when I don't know what to do with myself, my feet know where to go. I reached up for the cord inside the door and pulled it. The workshop filled with that amber light, low and warm, the color of old pine under a good lamp. The smell reached me a second later, the way it always does, like it lives in the walls and only needs a little air to remind you it's there. Sawdust and linseed oil and something deeper underneath. Something that has been soaking into this place since my father first drove a nail into these boards. I stood in the doorway and breathed it in and tried not to think too hard about anything. I walked the floor slowly. I touched the surface of the oak dining table. I had finished last week, ran 2 fingers along the edge, where I'd spent an afternoon getting the final radius exactly right. I straightened the chisels on the wall rack, even though they didn't need straightening. I checked the bandsaw blade tension for no reason. I did all the small familiar things a man does when he's in a place that makes sense to him, and the rest of the world doesn't quite yet. My phone buzzed at 5:20. "Marcus, you're already up," he said. It wasn't a question. "Just in the shop," I said. "Of course you are." I heard him pour coffee on his end, the particular sound of his old percolator that he's refused to replace since at least the second Bush administration. "How are you holding up?" "It's fine," I said. "Getting there." He was quiet for a moment. "Margaret talked to a few people at the rehearsal dinner last night, after you'd gone." Another pause, and I knew from the pause that what came next was the actual reason he had called. Diane was moving around the room, Walt, talking to people. Preston was doing the same thing on the other side. Margaret couldn't hear everything, but she heard Diane tell someone, one of Ethan's old friends, she thinks that she hoped today would be a chance to set things straight. I leaned back against my workbench. Outside, a single bird started up somewhere in the neighbor's yard. Just one note, then silence. "I set things straight," I said. That's what she said. I don't know what she's planning, but she's planning something. Marcus's voice was steady. Measured, he's always been the one who delivers bad news like it's a weather report, factual and calm and without extra weight. "I just wanted you to know before you walked in there." We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. The drive to St. Catherine's parking, whether the forecast had held. It had blue skies, a high around 68, the kind of September day that Portland offers you maybe a dozen times a year as an apology for all the gray. I told him I'd see him there. He told me to eat something before I left. After we hung up, I stood in the quiet of the shop and looked at the workbench. The suit was waiting on the back of the bedroom door, pressed and ready, the one I'd taken to the cleaners 3 weeks ago for the first time in years. The last occasion I'd worn it was the retirement party for Tom Briggs, and before that, I honestly could not tell you. A carpenter doesn't have much call for a good suit. The world I work in is measured in grain direction and moisture content, not in pocket squares and collar stays. I went inside and put it on. The mirror on the back of the bathroom door gave me a full accounting. 58 years old, gray at the temple's jaw that hasn't been fully smooth in a decade. I straightened the lapels and looked at my hands resting against the dark fabric of the jacket, the knuckle permanently stained with the ghosts of old finishes, the skin thick across the palms. A small scar on my right index finger from a chisel slip in 2003 that healed crooked. These are not the hands of a man who signs loan documents or sits at a glass-topped desk. I've never wished they were. I went back to the workshop for the hatchet hanging by the door habit again, but stopped when I reached my father's old desk against the far wall. Something made me go to it. That old pull, the one that has no name, but has been sending me to that drawer for 14 years. I reached down and pulled open the bottom drawer. It was empty. I stood very still. I looked at the place where the folded letter had sat, where I had put it the night Diane walked out in 2011, where I had touched it on hard nights without taking it out, where I had checked for it so many times it had become its own kind of ritual. The drawer wasn't disturbed. Nothing had been knocked over or shuffled around. The letter was simply gone as cleanly as if it had never been there. I opened the middle drawer, the top. I checked the shelf above the desk and the cedar box where I keep warranties and old receipts. I moved slowly the way a person moves when they are trying very hard to stay calm. Then I stopped. I thought about calling Ethan. The thought sat there fully formed, and I turned it over once and set it down. It was his wedding morning. He was somewhere across the city in a hotel room, probably awake already, probably buttoning his collar and trying to keep his hands steady. Whatever was happening here in this workshop, in this drawer, it was not something I was going to carry through his door on the most important morning of his life. I closed the drawer. In the corner of the shop on the low shelf where I keep the projects I've finished but haven't yet delivered, sat a small wooden box. Cherry wood, reddish-brown brass hinges a simple latch. E.C. Carved into the lid with a V-chisel, the letters slightly uneven the way hand-carved letters always are. Ethan had left it here on his last visit to the workshop 3 weeks before the wedding, with no particular explanation. Just set it on the shelf and smiled and said he'd get it soon. I picked it up, tucked it under my arm. Outside, the sky over Portland had shifted from black to deep blue to that pale gray pink that arrives just before the sun commits to the day. The air was cool and clean, the kind you notice in your lungs. A mourning dove was calling from somewhere in the old oak tree 2 houses down, one long note, then 2 short, repeating itself, with the patience of something that has been doing this a long time. I locked the workshop door behind me, walked to my truck, and set the wooden box on the passenger seat. I told myself maybe I moved the letter somewhere safe and simply forgot. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. I told myself a lot of things in the gray September light, with sawdust still on my boots and my old suit jacket settling across my shoulders. But deep inside, something told me that today was going to be very different from anything I had imagined. I saw the car before I saw them. A black Range Rover late model parked directly across from the entrance to street. Catherine's with 2 wheels riding up on the curb, and its nose angled into the fire lane like a yellow line painted on asphalt, was more of a suggestion than an actual rule. I noticed it the way you notice something that is slightly wrong in a familiar picture. Not dramatic, not alarming, just off by a few degrees from how things are supposed to be. I was standing on the steps with Marcus about 40 minutes before the ceremony was due to start, watching the last of the guests file in. The morning had come in clean and blue, the kind of September day that Portland hoards like something precious. Light through the maple trees, a mild breeze off the west hills, the distant sound of the bell from the church on the next block, doing its 10 o'clock count. Then the Range Rover's doors opened. Preston stepped out first. Charcoal suit pocket square, the kind of tailoring that costs more than most people spend on a used car. He straightened his cuffs as his feet hit the pavement. Not a nervous gesture, not a habitual one, but the deliberate kind, the kind that says I am aware that people are watching, and I have decided to give them something worth watching. He turned and offered his hand to Diane. She was in white, not off-white, not ivory. Not champagne or cream, or any of the 100 diplomatic words the fashion industry has invented to describe the color that belongs by unspoken agreement to the bride at a wedding. White. A fitted dress with clean lines and a hem that fell just below the knee, her hair set heels, a small pearl earring on each side. She stepped out of the Range Rover and smoothed the front of her dress and looked up at St. Catherine's with the expression of a woman arriving somewhere she was fully prepared to be. Marcus made a sound beside me. Not a word, just a sound. "Yeah," I said quietly. They moved up the front steps together, and I watched Preston's eyes do something I had seen them do before in my workshop in the months leading up to this day. He looked at the building, the courtyard, the gathered guests, the arrangement of it all, with the calm, comprehensive attention of a man assessing a property. Not appreciating it, assessing it. I let them pass and gave it 60 seconds before I went inside. The foyer of St. Catherine's is a long, high-ceilinged space with a stone floor and a row of arched windows on the south side that throw good light in the morning. Guests were moving through it in both directions. People finding programs, greeting each other, the hum of 100 quiet conversations weaving together under that vaulted ceiling. I found Marcus near the inner doors, and we stood together and watched the room. It didn't take long to see the pattern. Preston moved through the foyer the way a current moves through water, without appearing to push anything, but shifting everything slightly in his direction. Within 30 seconds of joining a group, he was at the center of it. I watched him do it 3 times in 10 minutes. A hand on a shoulder here, a laugh at the right moment there. A business card produced from his breast pocket with the ease of a man who has been producing business cards at social occasions for 30 years. I caught the word development once, and the phrase regional portfolio, and once distinctly Ethan's future. Diane found me about 20 minutes before the ceremony. I saw her coming across the foyer, and I kept my expression neutral and my shoulders level. She walked with the kind of confidence that is partly genuine and partly constructed the way you walk when you've practiced being in a room. "Walt," she said, same tone as always, familiar, slightly flattened the tone of someone for whom your name has become a piece of old furniture they no longer see clearly. "You look nice." Thanks," I said. "So do you." She smiled and looked briefly around the room before coming back to me. "I wanted to mention something before everything gets underway. Preston had been talking to some people at his company. He has a position opening up after the new year. Something in client development, Pacific Northwest Territory. He thought it might be a good fit for Ethan. After the honeymoon, of course. No pressure, just, it's there, if Ethan wants to explore it." I looked at her for a moment. A position in Preston's company, offered through Diane in a church foyer, 20 minutes before her son's wedding, framed his generosity. The third offer had come to my workshop in a suit. This one came wrapped in a smile and delivered before witnesses. "I'll let Ethan know it was mentioned," I said. Something shifted in her expression. The smallest adjustment, the kind you'd miss if you weren't watching for it. She'd expected something else. A thank you, maybe, or a refusal she could use later. "Good," she said. She touched my arm once briefly and turned back toward the room. I rejoined Marcus. "What did she say?" that he asked. "That she offered Ethan a job," I said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "At Preston's company?" "At Preston's company." He looked across the foyer to where Diane had found Preston near the south windows. They stood close together, and I watched Diane speak quietly while Preston listened with his hands clasped in front of him. Her expression was the expression of someone going through a checklist. His was the expression of someone who has already calculated the outcome and is simply waiting for the sequence to complete. The cocktail hour continued around them. Guests moved between conversations. A tray of sparkling water went past. The string quartet near the inner doors played something light and undemanding. All of it normal, all of it pleasant, and underneath it, a current that most people in the room couldn't feel, but that I had been watching build for months. At one point, one of Ethan's college friends, a good-natured young man named Derek, who I'd met twice at Ethan's apartment, made his way over to Preston at the window. I watched Preston receive him with both hands the way a man receives someone he's been waiting to meet. And within a minute, he had Derek nodding along to something with the attentive expression of a person hearing something interesting for the first time. Marcus leaned slightly toward me. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "I'm watching." And I was. Because the thing about people who are good at this kind of work is that they count on you not watching. They count on you being too proud or too hurt or too busy managing your own feelings to pay attention to the mechanics of what they're doing. I was paying attention. When the wedding photographer appeared in the foyer doorway and called out cheerfully that it was time for everyone to make their way into the main hall, I put my glass down and started toward the inner doors. And that was when it settled over me, the quiet recognition that Diane had not said the thing she had come here to say. Not yet. Everything so far had been preparation, setup. The foyer, the job offer, the table-by-table circuit Preston had run through the cocktail crowd. She was waiting for a bigger audience. The ceremony was beautiful. I want to say that first before everything else that happened. I want to say it plainly and without qualification because it's true and because the things that came after don't change it. Ethan and Lily were married in St. Catherine's Church on a clear September morning, and it was beautiful, and I was there. When Lily appeared at the back of the sanctuary, the room did what rooms do when the bride arrives. It exhaled, shifted, turned. The string quartet lifted into something fuller. But what I remember is not the music or the light through the stained glass, or even the dress, though all of those things were right. What I remember is Ethan's face. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has chosen completely without reservation, without the small private footnote of doubt that most major decisions carry. Not overwhelmed, not nervous, just certain. The absolute certainty of a person who knows exactly where he belongs and is standing in that place. I lost the fight with myself about halfway through the vows. I wasn't going to cry. I had decided that in the workshop at 5 a.m, standing in my suit in front of the bathroom mirror, telling myself I was 58 years old, and I had been through harder things than a wedding. Both of those things are still true. The crying happened anyway. Just a few seconds, just once, when Ethan said his vows in that quiet, unhurried voice, the same voice he uses when he's telling me something he means. Marcus, standing beside me in the front row, passed me a folded handkerchief without comment. He had brought a spare. He knows me. After the ceremony, we moved into the courtyard and then through to the reception tent. And the afternoon opened up into that easy, floating quality that good wedding receptions have in the first hour. Everyone glad the weight of the ceremony still present, but lighter now. The day beginning to feel like a celebration rather than an occasion. I stayed close to the perimeter, not hiding, just watching. I had a glass of water, not sparkling, just water. And I moved slowly along the edge of the tent, talking when people came to talk to me, stepping back when they moved on. Tom Briggs found me and shook my hand again and said something genuine about Ethan that I'll keep. Marcus stayed nearby without being attached. He has always understood the difference between keeping someone company and hovering over them. I saw Diane approach the event coordinator about 40 minutes into the cocktail hour. I had been expecting something. Marcus had told me she would do something. I had watched her work the room all morning, and I knew in the low practical way you know things when you have been watching carefully, that the foyer and the job offer and the quiet table-by-table circuit had all been preliminary. So, when I saw her lean in toward the coordinator and say something, and then accept the microphone with the ease of a woman who has held one before, I was not surprised. I set my glass down. Then I picked it back up. I needed something to do with my hands. She stood at the front of the tent with 120 people in front of her, and she opened with warmth the way she always does. She talked about the day Ethan was born, the hospital, the particular exhaustion and joy of that first morning. She talked about raising a child, the years of it, the weight of the daily work that nobody sees or names. She was good at this. She has always been good at this. Then the speech turned the way I knew it would. She talked about doors, the doors that stay closed and the ones that open. She talked about a man who had come into their lives and seen potential where others had seen limitation, who had offered guidance and resources, and she said, something Ethan had needed a vision of what was possible beyond sawdust and a two-car garage. Preston at a table near the center accepted this with a measured nod, dignified, rehearsed. And then Diane looked at me, direct, unambiguous, the look of someone who has arrived at the line they came here to deliver. Walter did the best he could with what he had, she said. Her voice was even and her smile was still in place. But in the end, Ethan has the future he deserves. The room did not react loudly. There was a shift, a small rearrangement of energy, the way air changes in a room when a window is opened unexpectedly. A few people glanced in my direction. A few looked at their glasses. Tom Briggs across the tent was very still. I stood in my corner and held my glass of water and did not move. And then something happened that I had not planned for and had not expected. For just a moment, one breath, maybe two, I saw her. Not the woman standing at the front of the tent with a microphone and a prepared speech, and a man in a charcoal suit sitting behind her. I saw the woman I had known before all of that. Before Preston walked into a conference room in 2008 and began the slow work of convincing her that the life she had was not enough. A woman who had been ordinary and real, who had laughed at bad television and kept a garden that never quite worked, and made Ethan's Halloween costumes by hand because she wanted to. That woman was somewhere inside this one. I could see it just barely the way you can sometimes see the original grain of a piece of wood through a coat of heavy paint. I felt no anger in that moment. I have enough anger in me. I have had it in various quantities over 14 years, and I know its texture well. What I felt standing there was not anger. It was something older and quieter, a tired sadness for what she had chosen for the distance between what she had been and what she had allowed herself to become. That was all. Then the moment passed. She finished her speech. She raised her glass toward Ethan and Lily and said something gracious about their future, and the room applauded with the polite energy of people who are relieved that something is over. She looked at me, waiting. I raised my glass of water. A single unhurried lift. Not a toast, not a concession. Just an acknowledgement, the kind you give to something that has happened and cannot be taken back. A carpenter's nod. Diane's expression shifted. She had prepared for anger or silence or a visible wound. She had not prepared for this. She didn't know what to do with a man who looked at her without hatred. And for a moment, she simply stood there with her glass half raised and her smile beginning to come apart at the edges. 20 steps away, Ethan put his hand on the back of his chair, and slowly, with the same quiet certainty with which he had looked at Lily at the altar, he stood up. The sound a crystal glass makes when someone taps it with a spoon is a small sound. In a tent with 120 people, a string quartet nearby, and the ambient noise of an afternoon reception, it should have been almost nothing. A thin, bright note that carries maybe 20 feet before the room swallows it. But when Ethan tapped his glass, the sound went everywhere. Not because it was loud, because the room was already holding its breath. I don't know how to fully explain what a room feels like when it shifts. There is the ordinary quiet of a wedding toast. People setting down their glasses, turning politely in their chairs, giving a speaker the expected courtesy of their attention. And then there is the other kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't come from manners, the kind that comes from something in the room, recognizing before anyone can say why that something real is about to happen. This was the second kind. Ethan stood at the front of the tent with both hands resting on the table. He was not holding a folded paper. He was not looking down at his phone. He had no prepared remarks tucked into his jacket pocket, no index cards, nothing that indicated he had arranged this moment in the conventional way a person arranges a toast. What he had resting on the table in front of him was the wooden box. I saw it and my chest went still. Cherry wood, reddish-brown grain tight and clean, brass hinges, a simple latch. 2 initials carved into the lid in the slightly uneven way that hand-carved letters always are. When a man uses a V-chisel for the first time and his hands aren't yet sure of the pressure required. E.C. I had made that box in the winter of 2008 from the first piece of cherry wood Ethan had ever planed himself. He was 10 years old. He'd been in the shop with me for 2 Saturday mornings, and on the third I'd handed him a card scraper and a short board of cherry and told him to take it down to flat. He'd worked at it for an hour and 40 minutes without stopping checking the surface with his fingertips, the way I'd shown him feeling for the high spots, the drag, the grain direction. When he was done, the board was not perfect, but it was close, and more importantly, it was his. I'd built the box from that board and a few pieces of complimentary stock and handed it to him on a Tuesday evening before dinner. He'd taken it back to his room like it was made of something precious. And now he had brought it here. I had carried that same box under my arm from the workshop to my truck to the church this morning, holding it the way you hold something you don't fully understand yet. I had set it on the pew beside me during the ceremony and moved it to the table at my place during the reception without giving it conscious thought. The way you carry things that have been in your hands long enough to stop feeling like objects. I had not looked inside it. It had not occurred to me to look inside it. And somewhere in the course of this day, without my seeing it happen, the box had moved from my table to his. Ethan lifted it in both hands, and before he spoke, he looked at me, directly, deliberately, with an expression I recognized from when he was 13 years old, and had done something careful and considered and was showing me the result. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride, an offering. I want to start, he said, with something my dad built. His voice was steady, not loud, but carrying the way voices do when a room is genuinely quiet. He held up the box so the people near the front could see it clearly. He made this for me when I was 10. Cherry wood, the first piece I ever planned myself, by the way, which took me approximately forever, and was not as flat as I told him it was. A soft laugh moved through the front tables. Even a few people near the back smiled. He told me it was for keeping the most important things, the things that don't need much space. He set the box back on the table and looked out at the room. Dad, you always said that. The most important things don't take up much space. He paused. You were right about that. You were right about a lot of things it took me a while to understand. I put my hand flat on the table. I was not going to fall apart in this tent. I had decided that. I was deciding it again. At the center table, Preston's smile remained in place. Composed appropriate the smile of a man attending a pleasant family occasion. He was holding his champagne glass at chest height, and he had the relaxed posture of someone who expects the next several minutes to pass agreeably. He had seen wedding toasts before. He knew how they went. There would be a story or two, perhaps a joke, a warm conclusion directed at the bride and groom. Nothing that required him to adjust anything. He did not yet understand what was on the table. I noticed Lily beside Ethan. She was not watching the room. She was watching him, with her hands folded in her lap, and that expression, the one I had seen in the tent doorway earlier, the one I had not been able to read. The small, quiet smile that belonged to someone who has been carrying a piece of knowledge for a while and is watching the moment when it finally gets to be said out loud. She had known, not just today. She had known this was coming, and she had kept it, and she had let it arrive in its own time and its own way. The smile I had seen earlier and not understood was the smile of a woman who had helped her husband prepare something true. I did not know then how much she had been part of this. I would find out later, but sitting in that tent watching Ethan hold the box and watching Lily watch him, I understood enough. Under Ethan's left arm, tucked close against his side, I noticed a small notebook. Slim, dark-covered, the kind you find at a hardware store for a few dollars. I had seen that notebook before, had watched him pull it out in my workshop on a Tuesday night in July, and write in it with the focused expression of a man making sure he gets something exactly right. I had not asked what he was writing. Now I thought I might understand. Ethan's hand moved to the latch on the box. He opened it. The room leaned forward without moving that imperceptible collective tilt that happens when everyone in a space wants to see the same thing at the same time. Inside the box, resting on a small square of dark fabric, was a piece of paper, folded twice. The kind of fold that had been made deliberately carefully by hands that were doing something that felt important. The paper had gone the color of old honey at the edges. The corners were soft, worn round with time. It was the kind of object that has spent a long time in the dark held onto, and never discarded, patient in the way that only kept things can be patient. Ethan looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then he looked at me. I recognized my own handwriting from 20 feet away. Not because the letters were large, they weren't. I have always written small, the habit of a man who grew up leaving notes in workshop margins and on the backs of lumber orders. But there is something about your own handwriting that your eye knows before your mind does. The particular lean of the letters. The way I have always made the letter F with a slight hook at the bottom that no one ever taught me. Ethan was holding the paper at reading distance, and the tent was not brightly lit. But I knew what I was looking at the moment he unfolded it. The room around me stopped mattering. Ethan looked down at the page. He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, just gathering the way a person gathers before they say something they want to say exactly right. Then he began to read. Dear Ethan, if you're reading this, it's because I finally found the courage to give it to you, or because you found it yourself. Either way, I'm glad. I had written those words in January of 2011, sitting at my father's old desk in the workshop at 11:30 at night, 2 weeks after Diane had taken her last boxes from the house. Ethan had been asleep. The shop had been cold. I had written by the lamp on the desk corner because I needed to put something somewhere that wasn't my own chest. Ethan kept reading. He read the part where I wrote about being afraid not of being alone, but of not being enough, of the particular fear that arrives when you are a man holding a life that belongs to someone else, and you are not sure your hands are steady enough for the weight of it. He read the lines I had written about the oatmeal, about the second bowl I put out every morning, because setting one bowl on a table for one person felt like giving up, and I had decided I was not going to give up. He read the part I had written to a 13-year-old boy about the shop, about how the shop was not just boards and tools, but the closest thing I had to a language for the things I could not say, out loud. I don't know who you'll be when you read this. Ethan read his voice even and clear, but I know who you are right now at 13, and I want you to know that who you are right now, the kid who comes to the shop on Saturday mornings and sands things that don't need sanding just to have somewhere to be, that kid is the best thing I've ever made, not because I built him, because he's building himself, and I am so proud I can barely write the words. The tent was completely silent, not the silence of people being politely attentive, the silence of a room holding something it does not want to disturb. Somewhere near the back I heard a sound that might have been a caught breath, or might have been the beginning of something else. Marcus beside me had both hands wrapped around the top of my chair back. I could feel the slight pressure of it, even though he wasn't touching me. I could not have spoken if someone had asked me to. Ethan finished the letter. He was quiet for a moment after the last line, and then he folded it once twice, the same way it had been folded for 14 years, and placed it carefully on the table beside the wooden box. Then he reached under his left arm and brought out the notebook. Slim. Dark cover. Hardware store variety, the kind that costs $3 and outlasts everything more expensive. I had watched him write in it in my workshop in July, in my parking lot in August, at a table in the corner of Margie's diner on a Wednesday evening when we'd stayed late after the check came. I had never asked what he was writing. I thought I had understood it was something private. He opened it to a marked page. "I also want to address something else," Ethan said. His voice had changed slightly, still steady, but carrying something different now. Precision. The tone of a man who is about to be exact. Before my wedding, before the day my father was supposed to be nothing but proud and glad, and present 3 separate attempts were made to change that. He looked at Preston, not a glance, not a brief acknowledgement. He looked at Preston the way you look at a document you are about to read from directly, without hostility, with a kind of clean factual calm that is somehow more confrontational than anger. "June 14th, Ethan said. "Restaurant on Northwest 23rd. They offer was a position in your company's Pacific Northwest development portfolio, contingent on my father having a quote-reduced presence at today's event." Preston's champagne glass, which had been sitting at chest height for most of the afternoon, came down slowly to the table. "July 22nd. Your office 14th floor, South Park Blocks. They offer was a specific dollar amount. I'll spare the room the number, but I wrote it down for the same arrangement, escalated." Ethan turned a page in the notebook without breaking eye contact. "My father turned that one down the same way he turned down the first one, without telling me, because he didn't want me to carry it." Diane had not moved. She was sitting at her table with her champagne glass still in her hand, and her expression had crossed some invisible line between the composed performance of the afternoon and something rawer and quieter underneath it. She was looking at Ethan, the way a person looks when they are hearing something they did not know and are only now understanding the shape of what they had agreed to. "August 9th, Ethan said. "My father's workshop, the final offer, largest amount, same condition." He paused. "My father asked you to leave. You said, and I'm reading directly here, nobody remembers the man who built the furniture. They only remember the man who paid for the house." A sound moved through the room. "That's not true," Ethan said simply. He closed the notebook. "I remember the man who built the furniture. I remember every joint and every finish and every Saturday morning and every time he showed up. I remember the letter in the bottom of this box. I remember who was there." He picked up the wooden box and held it for a moment. "The man who wrote that letter, who kept every promise he ever made, who built this box with wood, I planned myself when I was 10 years old, he is the only reason I am someone worth celebrating today. And I will not stand here while anyone suggests otherwise." The room came apart. Not all at once. There was a half-second of charged silence, the kind that precedes thunder. And then Marcus was on his feet, and then Tom Briggs. And then the sound rose and filled the tent completely. I heard someone near the back crying openly. I heard laughter that was the kind that comes out of relief. I heard names Ethan called out from somewhere I couldn't locate. I stood where I was and did not move. My hands were not steady. I was aware of that, a slight tremor in both palms, the kind that happens when the body is processing something larger than the ordinary. I looked at my son, standing at the front of the tent, with the wooden box in his hands and his wife beside him, and 120 people making the most joyful noise I had heard in 30 years of building things, in a quiet workshop. And Preston Hale, for the first time in what I imagine was a very long and carefully managed life, had absolutely nothing to say. Before we continue, just a quick note, some parts of the story ahead are shaped with fictional elements for storytelling purposes, so they may not fully reflect real-life events. If you're enjoying this, feel free to share and subscribe to follow the next stories. and if this isn't for you, you can stop here any time." He was gone before the wedding cake was cut. I didn't see him leave. One moment Preston Hale was at his table in the center of the tent, champagne glass on the tablecloth in front of him. And the next time I looked in that direction, the chair was empty. Someone told me later that he had gone out through the side exit near the catering station, the door that led to the service alley alongside the venue, not the main entrance where guests arrived with gifts and good intentions. He did not stop to speak to anyone. He did not find Ethan and Lily to offer congratulations. He did not find Diane. He simply left. The band had started by then, a four-piece that Ethan and Lily had chosen together, and the reception had shifted into the second register of a good wedding, the dancing beginning to take hold at the edges, the tables a little looser, the ties coming off. From the outside, if you had walked in at that moment, knowing nothing about the previous hour, you might have thought it was any Saturday evening celebration, going exactly as planned. But the room had changed. You could feel it if you'd been there for the whole afternoon. The guests who had been nodding along to Diane's toast an hour before now carried themselves differently around her. Not hostility. These were polite people at a wedding, and nobody was going to make a scene out of what had already been seen enough. But the warmth had dropped out of the air in her vicinity. The easy laughter, the shoulder touches, the pulled-out chairs, all of it had quietly redistributed itself to other parts of the room. I watched two women from Lily's family, who had been chatting with Diane earlier in the afternoon, steer themselves to a different table when she moved in their direction. They did it naturally the way people do when the instinct runs ahead of the decision. For the first time since the Range Rover had pulled up to the curb that morning, Diane was standing alone. I saw it happen. I was across the tent with Marcus holding a glass of water. I hadn't finished, and watching the dance floor fill when I noticed her near the edge of the tent by the garden entrance. Standing with a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking, turned slightly away from the room, looking out toward the string lights strung between the trees in the courtyard outside. The posture of a person who has discovered that the space they were occupying has contracted around them. Marcus followed my line of sight. He didn't say anything. "I'll be back," I said. I walked across the tent and out through the garden entrance and found a quiet stretch of pathway between two rows of potted lavender where the noise from the band was muffled and the air was cooler, and the light was mostly from the string bulbs overhead. Diane was there a few moments later. I don't know if she followed me or if she'd been heading in the same direction independently. It didn't entirely matter. We stood for a moment, looking out at the courtyard garden. The lavender had gone dry for the season, the stalks silvery and still. Through the tent wall I could hear the muffled shape of a song I didn't recognize, and under it the low, indistinct sound of 100 people enjoying an evening. "I didn't know about the 3 offers," Diane said. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at the garden, at the string lights and the branches of the courtyard oak. Her voice was quiet and without the prepared quality it had carried all day. No warmth constructed for a purpose. No carefully calibrated smile behind the words. Just a sentence said plainly by a person who needed to say it. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about whether I believed her. I did. Not because Diane has never lied to me, she has, and I knew the texture of it. But because what I saw on her face when Ethan read from that notebook in the tent was not the expression of a person hearing a narrative adjusted for effect. It was the expression of a person hearing something they had not known, something that recontextualized a year's worth of events they had believed they understood. She had understood the plan. She had not known all the tools that were being used to execute it. "Okay," I said. She turned then and looked at me. And for a moment, the same moment I had glimpsed through a coat of paint in the tent, earlier the same grain beneath the surface, I saw the woman I had known before any of this. Before the conference room in 2008 and the years of slow erosion. She was standing in the garden outside her son's wedding reception, with her champagne glass going warm in her hand. And she looked at this particular moment like someone who had traveled a very long way to end up somewhere she had not intended. I let that recognition pass through me without holding on to it. There is a thing that happens when you carry anger long enough that it becomes something else, not acceptance, not forgiveness, not the absence of hurt, but a different kind of weight. Quieter, less urgent. The recognition that a thing happened, that it cost what it cost, and that you are still standing, and your son just gave the most important speech you will ever hear in your life, and the accounting of who did what, to whom has been settled, in a room of 120 people without you having to raise your voice once. I was not going to forgive Diane for the choices she had made. That was not what this was. But I was not going to stand in a courtyard garden holding on to something that had already served its purpose. "Take care of yourself," I said. I meant it. She nodded once. I walked back inside. The dance floor had opened up properly by then. Ethan and Lily were near the center, moving easily together, the way two people move when they've stopped thinking about the steps. Lily had taken her heels off and was holding them in one hand. Ethan was laughing at something she'd said close to his ear. I stood at the edge of the floor and watched them. Ethan glanced up after a moment and found me in the way he has always found me in a room, without searching the way you find something you know is there. He looked at my face and read whatever was on it, and then he gave me a single nod. Small, direct, certain. I nodded back. I picked up a fresh glass of water from a passing tray and stood there in the warm lit tent, surrounded by music and people, and the particular joy of an evening that had been fully earned. And I took a breath that went all the way down, the first real one of the day. But I've been a man who works with wood long enough to know that when something looks finished, you should always run your hand over the surface one more time before you call it done. Preston Hale was not the kind of man who accepted a loss quietly and went home to reconsider his choices. I just didn't know that yet. The first call came on a Tuesday morning. I was in the shop by 7, working on a commission that had been sitting half-finished since before the wedding, a window seat with hidden storage white oak. A young couple in Northeast Portland who needed it done before their first child arrived in November. Good work. Straightforward and satisfying, the kind of project that doesn't ask anything of you except your hands and your attention. I had the radio on low, and I was fitting the piano hinge on the interior lid when my phone buzzed on the workbench. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. There was no message. The second call came 2 hours later. Different number, same unknown quality, the kind of call that arrives from a number that has been used once and will not be used again. I let that one go too. The third came after lunch while I was eating a sandwich at the workbench and looking at the grain pattern on the oak lid I had just sanded. That one I answered mostly out of curiosity. A man's voice. Smooth, professionally warm, the tone of someone trained to sound like they are doing you a favor. He introduced himself as working in communications and said he'd attended the Calloway Bennett wedding and had a few questions about some statements made during the reception that he felt had been taken out of context. I told him I didn't have anything to say and hung up. By the fourth call, I understood what I was dealing with. Marcus confirmed it that evening. He called at 6:30, which in Marcus's schedule means something has come up that he's been sitting with for several hours and has finally decided needs to be said. I could hear the particular quality in his voice, that mix of genuine anger and reluctant amusement that he gets when something is absurd enough that he can't fully commit to either reaction. He said, "This man is attempting to rewrite a wedding toast." "I know," I said. "I've had 3 people reach out to me today. 3, from the guest list." He paused. He's been calling people, the ones who were near his table, the ones he spent time with during cocktails, telling them that Ethan was under stress, that the notebook was full of exaggerations, that the whole thing was a family dispute being aired inappropriately at a social occasion. "Uh-huh," I said. He's also, and I want you to understand, I am trying to describe this without my head coming off apparently paying someone to post things online. There are posts going around that describe the reception as a, quote, complicated family conflict, and suggest that both sides had things to answer for. I set my sandwich down. Both sides, Marcus confirmed. There was a brief silence between us, the kind that contains a shared understanding that has no need to be spoken aloud. I had done nothing at that wedding except hold a glass of water and nod. My contribution to the afternoon's events had been sitting in the front row and not falling apart during a letter that my son read aloud from a box he had carried across the city. "You know what I'm gonna do about this," I said. "Nothing," Marcus said immediately. "Nothing," I agreed. I hung up and went back to the window seat. The hinge fit needed adjusting. The lid was catching on the right side. Barely perceptible, but enough that I'd feel it every time I opened and closed it in my mind for the rest of the year if I left it. I spent 40 minutes getting it right. When I was finished, I ran my hand along the underside of the lid and felt the movement clean and even and perfectly weighted. And that was more satisfying than anything I might have accomplished by returning phone calls. I don't know who the guest was. I've never found out, and I don't particularly need to. Someone at the wedding, some ordinary person with a phone and a decent eye for framing, had recorded Ethan's toast. All of it, apparently. From the moment he stood up to the last word, before the room came apart. About 11 minutes of footage, according to Ethan, shot from the middle of the tent, with a steady hand and surprisingly good sound. They posted it 3 days after the wedding. Within a day, it had reached the kind of numbers that make your phone unusable for other purposes. Within 2 days, those numbers had doubled. Every post that Preston's communications people had placed online, the carefully worded both sides narratives, the complicated family conflict language, the attempts to sand down the edges of what had happened in that tent, disappeared beneath it like furniture under a tidal wave. You can't argue with 11 minutes of a man reading his father's 14-year-old letter in a room full of crying people. Ethan called on the 4th day. I was in the shop again, in approximately the same position I had been in for the last 4 days, making steady progress on a window seat that was going to be the finest thing I had built in the last 3 years. My phone rang and I saw it was him, and I picked up fully expecting to hear about the honeymoon or Lily or some minor logistical matter about the apartment. "Dad," he said, "have you seen it?" And seen what I said, though I knew. A small pause. "The video. Someone posted the whole toast. It's Dad. It's everywhere. Everywhere," I repeated. "Millions of views. It keeps going." His voice had that quality it gets when something has surprised him, past his usual composure, slightly faster, slightly higher. "People are commenting. From all over, they're talking about you, about the letter about the box. Dad. People are crying in the comments." I looked out the workshop window at the afternoon light, coming through the maple trees in the backyard. The leaves had turned since the wedding, the green going yellow at the edges, the specific color of a Portland September sliding into October. A clean afternoon. Quiet. The kind of quiet I have spent 30 years building things inside of. "Good," I said. A beat of silence. "That's all you've got," Ethan said. "Good." "And that's all I've got," I said. "How's Lily?" He laughed. The full laugh unguarded, the one he's had since he was 9 years old. "She says hi. She also says you are the most unflappable person she has ever met, and she means that as a compliment." "And tell her I'll take it," I said. We talked for a few more minutes, the honeymoon, the apartment, a project Ethan was starting at work that he wanted to tell me about at length when he had more time. Ordinary things. Good things. The kind of conversation that doesn't carry any weight except the pleasant weight of two people who like each other talking on a Tuesday afternoon. After we hung up, I stood at the workbench for a moment with the phone in my hand looking at the unfinished window seat. Preston Hale had spent 2 decades building a reputation on carefully managed appearances, on being the man in the room whose version of events got accepted because he was the one who told it first and told it confidently and made sure the people who mattered heard it from him. 2 decades of that. Conference rooms and cocktail parties and the particular social machinery that runs on who shakes whose hand and what gets said at which table. In 72 hours, a wedding toast had started pulling it apart. And the worst of it was still waiting for him. 6 weeks after the wedding, I was in the shop working on a rocking chair. A commission from an older woman in Lake Oswego. She'd seen a chair I'd built for someone else 3 years ago and tracked me down through 2 intermediaries to ask if I'd make one for her front porch. White oak again, steam-bent rockers, the kind of proportions that take longer to get right than the actual construction. I had been fitting the back slats that morning, checking the spacing by feel when Marcus called. I knew from the first second what kind of call it was. There is a tone my brother uses when he has heard something significant, not alarming, not joyful, but the specific gravity of a man who has processed information carefully before deciding to pass it on. I have been recognizing that tone since we were teenagers. He has used it maybe a dozen times in our lives for things that mattered. "You should sit down," he said. I pulled the wooden stool out from under the bench and sat down. "Go ahead." What Marcus told me over the next 10 minutes in his careful, measured way. Was this an investigation into the business practices of Preston Hale's real estate development company had been formally opened? Not recently, the process had begun months before the wedding, initiated by a regulatory body that had been building a case quietly without press releases or public announcements, in the way that serious financial investigations actually work. The kind of work that takes time and doesn't announce itself until it is ready. The viral video had not created the investigation. That point mattered to me, and Marcus understood that it would, which is why he said it plainly and early. Preston's problems built up over years of the particular kind of conduct that eventually attracts attention from people whose job it is to pay attention. Misrepresented investment returns. A pattern of deals structured to benefit insiders at the expense of outside stakeholders. A trail of smaller stories from people who had signed things they didn't fully understand, and later found themselves in positions they hadn't anticipated. None of that had anything to do with a notebook or a wedding toast. What the video had done, what 11 minutes of Ethan reading from a box in a tent in Portland had done, was something different and in some ways more significant. It had given other people permission to speak. That is the thing about stories that land in the right way at the right moment. They don't create the truth, but they make the truth easier to say out loud. Men and women who had been on the receiving end of Preston's particular methods, people who had taken his money, or his offers, or his careful management of their perception of themselves had come forward after watching a 27-year-old stand up at his own wedding and read a letter his father had kept for 14 years. Ethan's notebook had been submitted as supporting documentation. Dates, locations, specific dollar amounts, verbatim language. One piece among many, Marcus said. A useful one. The notebook mattered, Marcus said. But it wasn't the foundation. The foundation was already there. I set my sandpaper down on the workbench. "And Diane," I said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Ethan heard from her. She called him 2 days ago. He told me she might. "She didn't make excuses," Marcus said. From what Ethan said, she called to tell him she was sorry. Not the version of sorry that explains itself into something else. Just sorry. He paused. She also told him she's been talking to someone, a counselor, for a few months now. I looked at the rocking chair frame standing upright in the middle of the shop floor, all the pieces present not yet assembled, held together by nothing except their own geometry and the sawhorses underneath them. There is a particular moment in any complex build when everything is in position, but nothing is yet joined when the piece exists fully in potential and not yet in fact. I have always found that moment clarifying. I thought about Diane making a phone call that didn't benefit her position, calling her son not to explain or negotiate, but to say a plain and costly word. I thought about what that costs a person who has spent years surrounded by someone who treats admission of fault as weakness. I thought about the fact that Ethan had not called me to relay the conversation with an edge in his voice, or with the charged quality of someone processing fresh anger. He had told me the way you tell someone about something that has begun slowly to settle. How did Ethan take it? I asked. Carefully, Marcus said. The way he takes most things. That sounded right. Ethan had not arrived at 27 years old, without learning that some relationships take longer to understand than others, and some understanding arrives later than you'd wish for it. He would not be rushing anything. I sat on the wooden stool for a while after that. The rocking chair frame was in front of me, and the light through the south window was the particular low gold of a mid-October afternoon in Portland. And the shop was quiet in the way. It is quiet when nothing is running, no sander, no saw, no radio. Just the building itself, settling the way old buildings settle. I thought about a man I had never fully understood, trying to purchase something that was never for sale. I thought about the years of it, the phone calls and the offers, and the final conversation in this shop, when Preston had walked out with his parting line about furniture and houses. I thought about all the energy that had gone into managing a situation that had resolved itself, not because I fought back, but because I stayed in the shop and did my work and raised a son who knew the difference between what something cost and what it was worth. There is a version of this where I feel triumphant. I have tried it on a few times in quiet moments, and it has never fit right. Triumph implies that I wanted something to happen to Preston, that I was waiting for an outcome. I wasn't. I was making a window seat and a rocking chair, and trying not to let a phone number I didn't recognize ruin a perfectly good afternoon. What I felt sitting on that stool in October was something quieter than triumph. Marcus's voice came back through the phone. "You okay?" I considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The light through the window, the unfinished chair, the particular quality of the silence in this shop that had been mine for 30 years, and my father's for 30 years before that. Yeah, I said, just tired. He waited. The tired that comes from something finally being over, I said. The good kind. Diane's name on a phone screen still carries a particular weight. Not the sharp weight of the early years after she left, when seeing it could put a knot in my chest before I even answered. Something quieter than that now. A specific gravity that I had learned to carry, the way you learn to carry anything that has been with you long enough, not without noticing it, but without being stopped by it. It was a Wednesday evening in late October, 3 weeks after Marcus's call. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold, beside a set of drawings for the Lake Oswego rocking chair. Final measurements, joinery notes. The small adjustments I make at the end of a build when everything is ready to be committed to. The phone lit up on the table beside the drawings. I looked at it for one full breath. Then I picked it up. "Is Walt," she said. Diane," I said. The first few seconds of a conversation like that have their own particular quality. A kind of mutual taking of bearings. Two people establishing that they are both here and that the ground between them is passable. We had not spoken directly, just the two of us, since the garden at St. Catherine's 6 weeks before. That conversation had been brief and outdoor, and surrounded by the residual noise of a wedding reception. This one was quieter, more deliberate. She told me she had watched the video. Not once, several times, she said. She had watched Ethan stand up in that tent, and she had sat with what it showed her, and what it showed her was not something she had been fully prepared to see. She did not describe what specifically she felt. She did not need to, and I did not ask. Some things communicate themselves adequately without narration. I needed to call you directly, she said. Not through Ethan, not through lawyers or messages passed sideways. You. Okay, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, did you ever hate me, Walt? I sat back in my chair. The question landed the way honest questions land, not with drama, but with weight. She was not asking to be reassured. She was asking because she had watched 11 minutes of footage and done her own accounting, and arrived at a number she was willing to hear confirmed. No, I said. I thought about it for another moment to make sure I was being accurate rather than kind. I was angry for a while, hurt for longer than that. But hate takes a kind of sustained attention I didn't have to spare. I paused. I was too busy raising our son. The silence on her end lasted several seconds. I know, she said finally, and then more quietly, I know. We talked for a few more minutes. Not about Preston. That conversation belonged to investigators and attorneys, now not to the two of us on a Wednesday evening. Not about the past in any comprehensive way. Small things. She asked about the shop. I asked about her sister in Bend who had been unwell earlier in the year. Ordinary inquiries of two people who had once known everything about each other and now knew the outline. When we said goodbye, it was without ceremony, not warm in the way that old warmth returns, but not cold either. The temperature of something that has found its resting place after a long time in motion. I set the phone down and sat for a while at the kitchen table with my cold tea and my drawings. Then I went to the workshop. I don't know entirely why. Habit, probably. The same pull that had been sending my feet across the back lawn in the dark for 30 years. I turned on the lamp, stood in the amber light, breathed the shop in. Then I walked to the desk in the far corner and opened the bottom drawer, empty. The way it had been since the morning of the wedding. I stood there looking at it for a long moment. For 14 years, the letter had been the reason I opened that drawer. The folded paper had been the thing that made the empty space a container for something, a place that held a weight even when I didn't take it out. When I had opened the drawer on the wedding morning and found it gone, the emptiness had been vertiginous, a sudden absence where I had counted on presence. Now I looked at the same empty drawer and felt something I had not expected. It felt right. The letter had been kept for a purpose. It had served that purpose completely and publicly in a tent in Northwest Portland in front of 120 people. It had been read aloud in Ethan's voice and received by a room full of witnesses, and it lived now somewhere larger than a drawer in Ethan's hands in the wooden box. In 11 minutes of footage that had traveled farther than anything I have ever built. The drawer being empty was not a loss. It was a completion. I closed it gently and turned off the lamp. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in November, I heard tires on the gravel outside the workshop at 8:15. I knew it was Ethan before I saw him. There is a particular way he parks slightly crooked left wheel a few inches further from the fence than it needs to be, a habit he developed at 17 and has never corrected. I have never mentioned it. He came through the side door with 2 cups from the place on Alberta Street he knows I prefer, and he sat down on the tall wooden stool without any particular opening, which is what he does when he has something to say that matters. He sat with his coffee and looked around the shop for a moment, at the tools on the wall and the half-assembled rocking chair on the sawhorses, and the long row of oak lumber I'd been conditioning since August. And then he said it. Lily's pregnant. I set my coffee down on the workbench very carefully. I looked at my son, 27 years old, sitting on a wooden stool in my father's workshop, in a city still waking up on a November morning, with the particular expression of a man who is only beginning to understand what he is holding, and I felt something move through me that I don't have a precise word for. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Recognition, maybe. The sense of a pattern continuing that began before either of us was in it. How is she? I said. Good, he said. Really good. She wanted me to tell you in person. We drank our coffee. We didn't say much for a few minutes, which is one of the things Ethan and I have always been able to do, occupy a shared silence without filling it unnecessarily. The shop held us the way it has always held us. Then I stood up. I went to the lumber rack and ran my hand along the oak boards I'd been conditioning, tight grain, clean color, the best wood I had in the building. I pulled 2 boards and carried them to the workbench. "We should start on something," I said. Ethan looked at the boards. He looked at me. "A crib," he said. "Your grandfather made furniture for 3 generations of this family," I said. "I don't see why we should stop now." He stood up from the stool and came to the bench. He picked up the first board in both hands, turning it to look at the grain in the morning light coming through the south window. The same light that had come through that window since my father first cut the opening in 1971. He looked up at me. "It's show me how Grandpa used to start," he said. I put my hand on his shoulder. "First," I said, "you feel the grain. I have been a carpenter for 31 years. My father was a carpenter before me. He learned it from a man named Gerald Pruitt in a small shop in eastern Oregon in the early 1960s. When wood was still selected by hand and the measure of a craftsman was how long his work lasted after he was gone. Robert Calloway built furniture that is still in use in houses across this city. A dining table in a home on Southeast Hawthorne. A set of bookshelves in a school library in Milwaukee that I drove past 2 years ago and recognized by the joinery on the corners. He built things that outlived his hands, and that was the standard he handed me along with the tools. I did not set out to win anything. That is the thing I want to be clear about now, that I have the distance to say it plainly. The months that led up to Ethan's wedding and the day itself and everything that came after, I did not move through any of it with a strategy. I did not have a counter plan. I did not make moves designed to produce outcomes. I went to work in the morning and came home in the evening and put oatmeal on the table and showed up to the things that mattered and tried imperfectly and without a scoreboard. To be the father I had promised myself I would be, on the night I wrote a letter by lamplight in a cold workshop while my 13-year-old son slept down the hall. Preston Hale spent 2 decades building something through transactions, through the careful management of who knew what and who owed whom, and which version of a story got told first. He was skilled at it. I will give him that. The machinery he constructed was impressive in the way that complicated machinery is impressive. Many moving parts, all of them controlled, all of them serving a designed result. But you cannot build a person that way. A person is not a transaction. A son is not an investment that pays returns on the right terms. The relationship I had with Ethan over 27 years was not produced by leverage or positioning. It was produced by oatmeal and Saturday mornings and 4-hour drives and school plays, and a notebook that Ethan filled with his own handwriting, because he had been taught by example that precision and honesty matter, and that you write things down so you don't lose them. The wooden box did not cost much. I built it from scraps and a board that a 10-year-old had planed himself imperfectly, with more patience than skill. The letter inside it was not eloquent. I read fragments of it aloud in my own memory after the wedding, and I could see the places where the sentences were clumsy, where I was reaching for language I didn't quite have at 44 years old and hadn't yet earned. It was honest. That was all it was. An honest letter from a frightened man who loved his son and did not know how to say it out loud, and so said it the only way he knew, by writing it down and putting it somewhere and hoping someday it would reach the person it was written for. It reached him. That is the whole of it, really. That is the thing I come back to when I think about that afternoon in the tent and all the months that preceded it and everything that came after. Not Preston's face. Not the applause, not the investigation or the video or any of the machinery that ground itself to pieces after the wedding. I come back to one moment. Ethan standing at the front of a reception tent, holding a wooden box I built from his first piece of cherry wood. And him looking up from the letter, looking up and finding me across the room with the ease of someone who has always known where to look, and the expression on his face in that moment. I had spent 30 years wondering if I was doing it right. Not loudly, not in a way I spoke about, but the question was always present the way background noise is present, constant enough that you stop noticing it, but there when the room goes quiet. Whether the long hours and the tuition and the Saturday mornings and the silent companionship of a workshop were enough. Whether a boy who had lost his mother from his daily life at 13 had been given sufficient ballast against the things the world would eventually ask of him. I saw the answer in his face when he looked at me across that tent. He looked at me, and I saw myself reflected back, not the version I feared I had been, the one that fell short and worked too late and cried in a cold workshop and couldn't hold a marriage together. The version I had been trying to become for 30 years. A man who showed up. A man who kept his word. A man whose hands were rough from honest work, and whose house was small, and whose truck was old, but who had never once let his son stand at an altar holding a box full of kept promises and felt anything but held. That was all I had ever wanted. Not victory, not vindication. Just that to be seen accurately by the person whose opinion of me has always mattered most. I think about what my father told me once near the end of his life when I asked him what he had learned from 30 years of building things. He thought about it for a while, the way he thought about everything with the unhurried consideration of a man who did not believe that silence was a problem to be solved. Then he said the things that last are never the most expensive ones. They're the ones made from time, from patience, from hands that were there every day. I did not understand it fully when he said it. I understand it now. Outside the workshop window, Portland is doing what Portland does in November, gray and quiet. The maple trees bear the city, moving at its smaller winter pace. Inside the lamp throws its amber light across the workbench. The smell of this place is exactly what it has always been, pine and linseed oil, and something underneath both of them that I cannot name, but that I have been breathing for 50 years. My father's chisels are on the wall in the same order he left them. The workbench he built in 1974 is still level. On the sawhorses in the center of the room, a crib is taking shape. Oak from the best boards I had. Steam-bent rails, pegged joints, the kind of construction that does not require glue, because the wood is fitted so precisely that it holds itself together through geometry and patience. I have been working on it for 3 weeks. Ethan comes on Saturdays and works beside me. Learning the parts of the process, I have not yet taught him the ways of fitting and checking and trusting your hands to feel what your eyes can't always see. I run my palm along the side rail and feel the grain running smooth, and even under my fingers. Clean. True. Something that will still be standing long after I am gone, in a room where a child will sleep in a life I helped build from the beginning. The sawdust settles on the floor. The lamp burns. The work continues. I'm not going to pretend this was an easy family story to carry for 14 years. There were nights in that workshop when I wasn't sure I was doing any of it right. Nights when the silence felt less like peace and more like losing. If you've lived through a family betrayal, a moment when someone who was supposed to stand beside you chose to tear something down instead, then you already know the particular weight of that. You know how it settles into your bones and stays. Here is what I wish I had understood. Sooner don't do what I did and carry it alone. I folded a letter, put it in a drawer, and kept it there for 14 years, because I didn't know how to hand it to my son. Don't wait that long. The people who need to hear the truth from you, tell them while you still have ordinary mornings together. Don't save the important things for a crisis. I believe God puts certain moments in front of us not to break us, but to show us what we're actually made of. That September morning, standing in my shop at 4:30 in the dark, I had no idea what the day would become. I just knew to keep showing up. That's all I ever did. And somehow, it was enough. This family story isn't about winning. It's about a wooden box, a folded letter, a boy who grew into a man who knew without being told that the most important things don't take up much space. A family betrayal will try to rewrite your history. Find a microphone and make its version the one that sticks. But the truth has a way of outlasting the performance. Always. The last thing this family story taught me, the work you do quietly in the years when nobody is watching, is the work that matters most. The sawdust on the floor, the second bowl of oatmeal, the 4-hour drive. That's the real record. Nobody can take that from you. If you're in the middle of your own family betrayal right now, hold on. Keep your hands on the work. Stay in the room. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know. Drop a comment below and tell me what would you have done in Walt's position, or or a moment like this. I read every single one. If you'd like to follow along for more stories like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. One small note: while this content draws from real human experiences and true emotions, certain elements have been shaped for storytelling purposes. If this style isn't your thing, no hard feelings. There's something for everyone out there. Thank you for being here until the very last word.